a joke. I can speak firsthand as a former student of Frank to the large reach of his research and political practice, which have had a critical impact on his students, but scholars, artists, and activists writ large, both nationally and internationally. From being on call with members of the Black Student Union, the BSU at UCI, to working with intergenerational Black community members for Black liberation in South Central at the Southern California Library, an epistolary of anti-racist and freedom struggle in South Central, to facilitating and supporting spaces for Black political education internationally in South Africa, the UK, England, Germany, Canada, Austria, just to name a few. What might be relevant for our conversation today is noting Frank's intellectual and political interventions that they often involve a kind of return to the questions of anti-Blackness as a complex and complicated historical political question. And if with the daily staggering evidence of anti-Blackness, this return forces us to rethink the relation between politics and the political, between resistance and liberation. The oeuvre of Frank's work also invites us to rethink the signs and contexts of state violence, the enduring psychic life of slavery and anti-Blackness, and Black liberation itself as an emancipatory discourse. That is, his work forces us to question the cultural signs and psychical cues and limits of Black liberation itself. So I think it is in this most acute sense that Frank's work reorients his readers critically to reflect on the ways in which a collective political imagination fails to contend with the uncertainty of Blackness, whether as a prohibition or occupying the position of non-sovereignty or nothingness. In his teaching more specifically, Frank never claims to be an expert of Lacan or psychoanalysis for that matter. But these questions alone conceiving the limits of the collective unconscious, or rather how the collective unconscious and political imagination are confronted with its own limits that cannot bear nor articulate the weight and encounter of anti-Blackness. I think this really all sheds light on Afro-pessimism's provocations and possible contributions to ongoing questions and critiques of psychoanalysis as both discourse and clinical practice. I also want to add that while there are many things I've taken away from Frank's teaching over the years, and they've certainly stayed with me or have come back to me for almost a decade now, something that has particularly stuck with me is his distinction, which he would harp on continuously over seminar and in the hallways, the distinction between scholars and academics. And he told us, his students, that there are hundreds and thousands of academics, but very few scholars in what he's called the cesspool of intrigue that is academia. So without getting lost in the weeds, I think in many ways, this also has a kind of psychoanalytic valence to it, that in the mirage of one's desires, in what one wants to know what they see and or see what they know, the subject occupies a curious and enigmatic position of partial truth. Yet more often than not, we see how this pans out as the subject who claims to know or to master a type of knowledge, rather than those few who sift the conditions that constitute a mirage of desire. So for me, then, Frank is a teacher and scholar in the most authentic sense, that he takes seriously the act and ongoing practice of meditating on the conditions of the psyche, of the Black psyche, and the prisms that enfold and unfold one's desire to know. In this final sense, he's been the most really humble and articulate of teachers, and instructing implicitly to us the ruse is in performing a kind of full speech, or a type of tongue of knowledge. So I can wax poetics about Frank as a teacher, scholar, thinker, and political organizer, but I'll stop here. Without any further introduction, please join me in welcoming Frank, who will be presenting on Paradigm and Violence to Afro-Pessimist Portals.
Thank you, Lynette. So let me ask Oh, and Evan and Celeste, thank you so much for all the contact work you've been doing, and over the past, I don't even know how long we've been communicating to get this going. And I wish, like everything else I've been doing, COVID has produced a kind of paradox in that it's horrific, and my wife Anita and I don't go anywhere. But in another sense, we travel everywhere because this is supposed to be an international book tour, and this week I was supposed to be in Amsterdam, and I think next week in Germany. And instead, I'm just going to sit in my study. What I've been doing about 50 events since April 7th when the book came out. And the interesting thing is that whereas I would have contacted maybe 70 to 100 and some people on each of these junkets, I'm actually seeing more people, and the return, especially the YouTube things people see over and over again. So that's been good. I want to ask Celeste and Evan, and then everyone, if at least for my remarks we could record this, and then if you and the members don't want the others recorded, because I'd like to share with my students.
Yeah, it is being recorded, Frank.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you to Lynette for that wonderful introduction. I kind of didn't know who she was talking about, but that's okay. Someone with my name. If we are only just a complex of signifiers, I'll take that, But and I really want to say how important Lynette's work has been to me over the years, in the sense that, for many people in the general, as the British would say, in the room, they think Afro-pessimism has just been in the room for about 7 years. Well, in point of fact, it's been actually since 2008, if not before. And it started with a sense that this is a big ear trumpet, which will be something that resonates, I guess, with at least Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's not like a discovery, like E equals MC squared. It's a way of listening to the symptomatic speech of Black suffering and codifying it into an interpretive lens. And I think that the way in which I enter, when I say the portals are my portals, if you speak to other people like Jared Sexton or David Marriott or Lynette Park, there are going to be other portals. I felt that when I came back from South Africa and had worked in the ANC, that the where scholarship had gone, and this division that Lynette talked about was a very, very important one between academics and scholars or intellectuals on one side, people who do the labor of intellectual work and understand with great intentionality that that labor is harnessed to a particular ideological project of revolt, revolution, subversion, as opposed to people who do the labor to be better widgets in the institution. And I was really kind of surprised and saddened by the fact that the Berkeley that I knew from 1970, when my dad was there on sabbatical, was no longer the Berkeley that I returned to go to graduate school. And so it basically turned out that the way it became a kind of theoretical lens was through, I would say, the labors of Kiana Ross, who's now teaching at Northwestern, Sora Hahn, who's now at UC Irvine, myself, Jared, Zakia Aman Jackson, who is at USC, and other people who did not go into academia, who were either undergrads at Berkeley or graduate students. And we were also part of grassroots organizing. And one of the things that we saw, felt, and experienced was the way in which whenever the symptomatic speech of Black people erupted in multiracial coalitions, which was on a trajectory, if it had been allowed to be elaborated, a trajectory of showing how the violence that elaborates and positions Black people may bear some performative resemblance to the violence that is experienced by Latinx people and non-Black women of color, but it is not actually structurally the same. It doesn't have the same utility. And how those conversations were completely shut down with the response of this is plain oppression Olympics, or Black people are bigoted also. Nowhere in Afro-pessimism is there an argument that Black people are good people. And that's not even an interesting question for me. That's a question of moral judgment. We're interested in questions of ethical assessment, which has to do with the distribution of power and the manifestation of institutional violence, as opposed to how people treat each other. Everyone is bigoted. Everyone suffers through projections of bigotry on the other. But it's just that, as David Marriott would write, especially in his first two books, On Black Men and A Haunted Life, Black fantasies have no objective value. And that's the key. In other words, Black fantasies are not subtended like right angles, lines on a right angle. Black fantasies are not subtended with structural violence. And that's the key. Not that Black people are good and non-Black people are bad. It's the access and availability to create a world and to motivate new modes of thought. And you absolutely, positively need violence to have any form of, and I'm going to keep using this word and hopefully it gets buried so I don't have to keep repeating it, essential transformation. There are all kinds of important variances, but I'm only talking about what is paradigmatically essential. So that was on the organizing side in the San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Bay Area. This kind of two things, this sense that people who were supposedly organizing along radical lines were really, if you just cut away the veneer of their discourse, their desire, and the tactics, were really just, at worst, sheepdogs for the consensus, and at best, members of the loyal opposition. They really had no vision of stasis and change, which would undo the world completely, but were actually motivating and agitating and performing civil disobedience for an expanded, for an expansion to the rigidity of civil society. In other words, revolutionary questions were actually being posed through reformist modalities, which were concerned with the relative elasticity or rigidity of modes of access to what already exists. And they missed an opportunity there. And the opportunity was the opportunity of Black embodiment, not what Black people think through secondary processes of signification in the pre-conscious, and not necessarily even what is going on through primary processes of signification in the unconscious, but what Blackness embodies. And it embodies an impossible demand, a demand beyond anything that's legible. And we felt that this kind of embodiment, this iconoclastic embodiment, should excite people, and it did not. It gave them anxiety. That was one thing. The other thing was returning to school, going back and forth to organizing in school. What we found was that the broadsides and political discourse of common sense that we were experiencing in struggle was being articulated and taught to us in very sophisticated ways in our psychoanalytic classes on Freud and Lacan, and in the classes that I took on Antonio Gramsci, Antonio Negri, and Marx. And that's vitally important. I want to stress that Afro-pessimism does not, these are the two foundational texts of all kinds of theories of change, which talk to the activist, even if the activist hasn't read the text, and insinuate a kind of intuitive understanding of what constitutes inaugural division in a paradigm. So that on the one hand, we had our teachers like Kaja Silverman. And when I say Kaja Silverman, for those of you who are familiar with her work, I'm only talking about the Kaja Silverman that I appreciate. which is the one that she is not now, okay? And that is the Kaja Silverman of the first three books, okay? The first three books, The Subject of Semiotics, Male Subjectivity at the Margins, and The Acoustic Mirror. After that, she gets into trying to figure out how to live her life as I would say as a white woman. This is falling out what she would say as a woman. And I'm categorically not interested in those questions. How does one live one's life? Okay. So I was excited to be taught through the modality of the first three books, which asks the question, how do we destroy Oedipus? Not how do we find a place for the female subject inside of a kind of cognitive mapping of kinship called Oedipus. So, but then even there was a problem. Just as with respect to our graduate teachers who were teaching us Gramsci and Marx and Negri, and I'm more steeped in political economy. I was a political commissar for the city of Johannesburg and 16 surrounding townships, one of 5 commissars for that area. I did political education workshops for above ground structures as well as for guerrilla cells. And my teachings were through teaching guerrillas and above ground activists the texts of Gramsci and Negri and Marx. I come to psychoanalysis kind of in blips and blurps, you know, which is why I want to say that if you want to continue with this and deepening the kind of schematization that I'm going to give you today, I would really encourage you to have the 4 superstars of Afro-pessimism / psychoanalysis. One is right here in the corner, Lynette Park. The other is Salamawit Sally Tarefe, who is now an assistant professor at Tulane. And of course, everyone knows Jared Sexton and David Marriott. So what we found was that the question, what does it mean to suffer, was assumed to be universally applicable. And so what you had was a kind of false conflict, which is elaborated by Kaja Silverman in her third book, Male Subjectivity at the Margins, in which she says, if you want to undo the world, first you have to destroy the artificial categories called woman and man through the disruption of Oedipus. And so she's trying to write a corrective against Gramsci, Marx, and Negri. It's a kind of schematizing corrective, which is to say that, which as she says in the first third of the book, yes, I believe that spontaneous consent to the ruling hegemony is what organizes civil society. And if you want to undo civil society, you must undo that spontaneous consent. But the foundation of civil society is not political economy, a la Marx. The foundation of civil society is the kinship structure, which is mapped over by Oedipus. And so what we need is a disruption of Oedipus by I won't get into her whole logic right now, but a disruption of Oedipus, which will then lead to a crisis of filiation, which then could happen. We could then move into a new form of kin relation that, remember, what is kinship for her? It is that grain of sand around which the pearl of civil society is built, okay? And so I was profoundly impressed with the revolutionary urgency of these first 3 books, which is to say, not finding it's not second wave feminism, which is to say, how can women have better rights? How can they have better pay? How can men and women share equally in the labor at home? No, which is to say, destroy these 2 categories because they don't exist existentially. There's no transparency in semiotics between the world and the word. But that leaves the black out. Just as on the other side, which she's arguing, I'm right, Marx is wrong, the essence of civil society is not political economy, but it is the way in which the kinship structure has been organized. And Marx would say, no, the essence of civil society is the mode of production. And so the mode of production has to be destroyed so that surplus value cannot be elaborated. And then the woman will be elaborated, as a kind of indirect payoff from that. And what we're saying very simply is that those are two arguments about what essentially makes the world, but they're arguments between humans, and they've forgotten one thing, which is a basic semiotic first principle, which is that if it is true that there is no inherent value to the signifier, which is to say that if there is no transparency between the signifier and the thing, that the signifier can only mean another concept, then it has, and that if value, which is to say meaning, can only be secured through collateral acquaintance, so CAT, to tell my undergraduates, gains its meaning through its collateral acquaintance, tiger, leopard, lynx, but it ultimately gains its value, meaning it signified its meaning through its opposition, which is to say dog or canine. If that is true, and if we accept that, then the word human has to exist with that limitation as well. In other words, it needs to have its semiotic other in order to secure its value. And this is precisely what Afro-pessimism is arguing. I want to read a short, first I want to, can I share my screen now, Celeste? Is that okay? Okay, cool. First I want to share my screen and show you kind of where I'm coming from with a diagram that I use to begin. I don't use this with grad students, or maybe I should, but to help undergrads grasp this. Okay, so here we have, and as you can tell, I'm not an artist. Are we seeing this?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So thank you. This is kind of like Freud's early topography, except for the bottom. What Silverman tells us is that, she appreciates his early topography, which is the preconscious interest, unconscious identification, and desire. And for number 3, she has memory. And that is more appreciated because she's more of a Lacanian than anything. And this comes closer to Lacan, thinking that the subject is a complex of signifiers. But there's an assumption, what we've done down here as to the third element of the subject, as opposed to memory, I've put in structural position or paradigm. And that's precisely because whereas Lynette, Sexton, myself, Marriott, and others have argued that preconscious interests and unconscious identification are components of the Black psyche, although Marriott has argued on Black men, he's asked the question, can there be a Black unconscious if the Black unconscious is always overdetermined or introjected with a sense that the only ideal is white, and that at least the unconscious must garrison itself against its own imago. So that's a big question here. But this whole thing, this number 3 is really where I'm trying to make my intervention, because it has not been proven, it has been asserted that all sentient beings are human, but it has not been proven. And the critique of that is precisely in the way we bring ourselves back to Patterson and Fanon, albeit not in ways that Patterson and Fanon would necessarily appreciate, which is to say that the slave, and we would argue Blackness is slaveness, has no access to the paradigm of the human, because the paradigm of the human is such that one exists as a subject of relationality inside of a kinship structure. The problem that Silverman has is not the kinship structure. She believes it's a universal phenomenon. The problem that she has is the map, the territorialization of the kinship structure qua Oedipus. So we're arguing that in social death, natal alienation forecloses access to number 3 as kinship. Furthermore, we would argue that slavery also forecloses Black access to political economy as economic agents. Black people are economic currency, not economic agents. And so what I'm doing here, and part of it is less than satisfactory because we would need weeks for me to argue all these, but I've argued them in books and you've been discussing them, and we can I'm giving you the claims without the proof, but we'll come back to this. Okay, so let me just have a couple more things and then we'll open it up. Some things that give you the basic touchstones of cohesion for Afro-pessimism. And I want to say that I can't tell you how much I appreciate the work that you all as an organization have been doing on this. Whether you agree with it or not, that's not my appreciation. Simply comes from a sense of engagement. It's been, for the first 10 years, Afro-pessimism was a subterranean, underground set of texts and debates and discussions between Black people in your own city. I mean, I done workshops for Black Lives Matter leadership up on 168th and Broadway, as Lynette said, Vienna, all different places, but it was really circulating amongst Black activists and Black scholars. And if it only ended there, I would be completely appreciative, because this is a moment in history very unlike any other moment in which grassroots Black subversives on the streets are reading this. And I'm talking about not just the streets of the United States, but the streets of Toronto, Montreal. There's a massive, massive grassroots movement which is challenging white power, as well as trying to undo the African National Congress and it's elaborating from the townships of Soweto and Kailicha around Cape Town, as well as the universities in South Africa. And the texts of this movement are Afro-pessimist texts. So it's become an international phenomenon internal to the Black community. And I'm glad that it's becomes a bit of debate and discussion external to it also. So what is Afro-pessimism? In the main, it makes a radical intervention in the way we think about positionality, as I showed you Freud's early topography, and violence. It argues that since there are no signifiers with extra systemic value, the word human must have its opposite in order to be legible. Otherwise, everyone is a human being, and therefore it could have no actual meaning unless humanness is, or unless you believe in God. You have to be an absolute secularist to account for this. Evan and Celeste, are you hearing me? I got a thing saying my email was unstable. And so okay.
I'm hearing fine. Yeah, I don't hear any problem.
Okay, good. So I'll ignore the notice. It argues that to secure the paradigm of humanity, whose inaugural division is the division between the human and the Black or slave, the Black object must be the destination of endless rituals of pre-logical violence, so that the human subject can know they are alive and relational. They can know they are human to the extent that they know they are Black. This is a very important point. And it's brought up very quickly and kind of left behind, or elaborated in different ways that are not quite as clear as we make it. But in the opening pages of Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death. And why do we like Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, even though there's a question as to whether or not Orlando Patterson thinks what we've done with his work is actually apropos. And the reason being is because one of the things that he says is that in order to have a stratified society, you have to have an ocean of violence. There cannot be communal relations in a stratified society unless there is an ocean of violence that makes that so. So in other words, to move from feudalism, serf and lord, into a new paradigmatic dimension, which is worker and capitalist, you've got to have decades of violence that looks pre-logical. But then he makes another point. Once the paradigm is secured, which is to say, once you have people like most of us here, unless some of you out there in Zoom land are trust fund babies, but if you are still working for a wage, then by the time capitalism has secured its global saturation, which is to say, by the time the English industrial modality has kicked to the curb mercantile capitalism of Holland and France, and made the organization of political economy dependent upon the command modality in which every being is confronted by the wage. When that happens, and when capitalism is global and secure, capitalism is just an example of a paradigm. We could think of another paradigm, which is the kinship structure of Western Oedipus, for example. Once that happens, then the violence that was needed, the oceanic, tsunami-like violence that was needed to move people into different positionalities, different temporalities, has to go away in order to secure the stability of the paradigm. In other words, it goes under the table or goes into remission and rears its ugly head contingently. And this is where the word contingent is so important to Afro-pessimism. The violence, we stay with the paradigm of capitalism for a moment. The violence needed to secure a new economic relationality through which you have the elongation of the working day, the extraction of surplus value, and the intensification of work. You don't want that violence that was needed to set that paradigm up to actually be the order of the day anymore. What you need to do paradigmatically is to transition from pre-logical violence into a mode of spontaneous hegemony in which people are giving their spontaneous consent to the new world order. And it doesn't mean people like their jobs. It means that they wake up in the morning and ask themselves the questions. The question is in the gut of their stomach with ulceric overtones. Today is, well, not on Saturday, because sometimes you have to work. Today is Friday. How much am I have to do? And how long am I going to have to do it? And once those questions saturate the psyche of everyone on the planet who is a member of the working class, then you don't want to actually browbeat them with the kind of ritualistic violence that was needed to set this paradigm up. You want hegemony, which is to say, what are the three constituent elements of hegemony? Influence, leadership, and consent. Which is to say, the influence of a class, meaning the influence of the ruling class, such that if you go to the store and shoplift, which is a righteous act, or if you rob a bank, which is another righteous act, you will feel guilty about it. In the words of Bertolt Brecht, who was not giving his spontaneous consent, there is no crime in robbing a bank. The only crime is in starting one, okay? But since at the moment that you believe in meritocracy, that you believe you should pay for what you get, that you believe that you should earn your way in society, that means that the paradigm has become stable. And to keep the stability going, you want hegemony, not violence. Violence when the worker transgresses the assumptive logic and the rules. And what Patterson has said is that you cannot think the paradigm of social death through the paradigm of gender oppression or the paradigm of economic oppression, because the paradigm of social death requires the repetition in ritualistic forms of the violence that was needed to set it up, even when the Black has become a good Negro. Even then, this is absolutely necessary because we need this. What am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that inaugural division between those who are elaborated and positioned through castration or alienation in language needs to be secured between those who are elaborated and positioned through direct relations of force. That is the difference between slave and humanity. And that has to continue, which is why the words Black and brown should not be linked together. Because when you have two paradigms of structural violence, which seem to be performatively the same, but one brown, anti-brown or anti-Latinx violence is secured through the trigger of transgressions, and anti-Black violence is absolutely necessary without there having to be any transgressions. It's necessary as a form of therapy, to use the language of the day, right? Okay, so moving on down. Afro-pessimism is an ear trumpet, listening to the symptoms of the Black experience to ascertain the structure of Black suffering, a lens of interpretation that articulates the grammar of suffering of the slave or the Black as a grammar of suffering that cannot be reconciled with the grammar of suffering of the human subaltern, which is to say non-Black women, non-Black queer, POC immigrants, or the white working class. Okay, a lens of interpretation that does not fall prey to the Anglo-American pedagogical impoverishment. What's the Anglo-American pedagogical impoverishment? Which is this is something that Matthew Arnold, if he didn't dream it up in 1869, he certainly was the used car salesman of it, which is to say that if you teach people in the public schools about problems, you have to link to the problem some kind of solution. That is the bane of Anglo-American existence, which makes us impoverished as intellectuals. The sense that you need to couple a solution with a problem. That kind of structure of thinking will never get you to prison abolition, let alone to the end of the US or Israel. It will only make you part of the loyal opposition, because you will be asking you'll have an analysis of suffering that is tethered to an ensemble of prescriptions that are underneath the umbrella of the world in which you already live, not a way for revolution. Okay, so a lens of interpretation fall prey to the Anglo-American pedagogical impoverishment, which is that the imperative that problems must be accompanied with legible solutions. As such, Afro-pessimism has, in comparison to psychoanalysis and Marxism, which are its two main interlocutors, only a descriptive scaffold or gesture, and not a prescriptive scaffold or gesture. Now, when I say this here, not a prescriptive scaffold or gesture, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here, because of course, you can find it on page 100 of the first French translation of Black Skin, White Mass, which is to start something, start what? The only thing we're starting, the end of the world, that's what. So Afro-pessimism does have a prescriptive gesture, which is the end of everyone's capacity to live their human life. But it is so hyperbolic that I found that on the lecture circuit, the only people who smile when I say this are a room full of Black people. Everybody else gives me knitted brow. What do you mean by that? How do we get there? And I go, oh, that's for us to know and you to find out, okay? Which sometimes goes over and sometimes doesn't. Okay, so what does the above mean? Lacan's descriptive gesture, and Lynette brought this up in her introduction, right? Empty speech. That's how the subject suffers. Not only that's not only how the subject suffers, but as you all know, that is the problem with what it means to be an American from his perspective, is that entification of the signifier, a kind of narcissism in which the American Republic, as a kind of macro exemplar of the narcissistic individual, fills the signifier up with meaning as though the word is a transparent window onto the real. Okay, that is the problem. And for Silverman and feminists, it's precisely why in a patriarchal order, where the name of the father exists and the kinship structure is organized by Oedipus, the woman in that suffers a double lack, as though there's an inferior essence to womanhood, and there is a kind of egoic monumentalization of manhood, right? Okay, so then moving here, what is Lacan's prescriptive scaffold? Full speech, which is to say, the intervention of the symbolic order into the stagnation of the imaginary in such a way as to get the adolescent or patient to understand that she, he, or they are no more and no less than a complex of signifiers. This allows the adolescent to give the other their otherness and to return tenacious fixation to relational logic, to deconstruct the debilitating egoic monumentalization that plagues not only the individual, but the state. So for feminists, this also entails the woman's elaboration and positioning, as I said before, via Oedipus and the inaugural division of man and woman. These categories then have to be, if we take Lacan's individuated project of helping the adolescent understand that there's nothing beyond the wall of language, as he writes in Ecrit, right? Nothing beyond the wall of language. To understand that you can rid yourself of tenacious fixation by giving yourself the pliability of signifiers, reaching into the symbolic order to transform how you think of past traumas and then transform your projections onto the people around you. Okay, that can also then expand to help you understand that we could probably move into a new transgender reorganizing / deorganizing or deconstructing of Oedipus that will then help us to finally realize that these two figures, man and woman, are not ordained by God. They are constructed through language, and we're on our way to a new world. The same goes for Marx, right? His descriptive scaffold, which is the problem of suffering, is the corruption of temporality. The capitalist class has corrupted time by instantiating a working day, which is to say that use value can be produced by working from 9 to 12, and then you go to lunch and you come back and you work from 1 to 5, and what you're doing is you're producing surplus value for the capitalist class, right? Through the intensification of work, the elongation of the working day, and this leads to the extraction of surplus value. One becomes alienated from one's labor power, and that's a bad thing. Alienation, as you all know, for Lacan, is simply alienating from the status of being polymorphously perverse into, you're castrated from that or alienated from that to become a subject of signifier. So alienation exists as a mode in both the Lacanian and the Marxist paradigmatic understanding, but it's a little bit different in either one. But exploitation is the same in both. The female subject is exploited in the household via Oedipus, and the worker is exploited in political economy via capital. What is his solution? His prescriptive gesture? Revolution. The destruction of the capitalist working day, and by extension, the destruction of both categories, capitalist and worker. So on the other side of this, man and woman, there are no more men and women, there's something else. It's a reorganization of kinship, and on the other side of this, there are no more workers and capitalists, there will be proletariats. The instantiation of communism and a new way of organizing political economy. So why is that not universal? The problem for the Black or the slave of both these scenarios is that both binaries, man and woman, boss and worker, are human subjects, even in the ontological eyes of their respective oppressors. Both binaries have human capacity, albeit subordinated, internal to the paradigms that oppress them, meaning their freedom comes not from the destruction of kinship, you see here, not from the destruction of kinship as a baseline paradigm of existence, be it filial, nor from the destruction of political economy as a baseline paradigm of economic existence, but from revolutionary reconstitution of those generic forms. And I said before, the Black or the slave has no access to filiation as a subject of kinship relations, nor any access to economy except as a mode of currency. So what secures the distinction above between humans, be they oppressors or oppressed, between all humans on one side and all Blacks? Again, what secures this distinction, if I get my little spell, I don't care about spelling, is an irreconcilable modality of paradigmatic violence mentioned in Patterson above. So how do we get our heads around this? Afro-pessimism is a deployment and elaboration of Patterson, but also a corrective of Patterson. Afro-pessimism's corrective is situated in Patterson's notion of recruitment. So what does Patterson say? He says that in his 1982 tome that was published by Harvard, he says that for decades, scholars have been writing books that purport to say definitionally what slavery is. And if they were in third grade, they'd have their hands whacked because they did not write books on a definition. What they did is they gave us reportage, monographs of reportage, which is to say, they told us about the experience of some slaves. They told us about the time of some slaves. They told us about where slaves were located in terms of plantations. Those are examples, not descriptions of a relational modality. So he says, I'm going to go back thousands of years and across the globe and try to find out what is the relational modality that makes for slavery, as opposed to a kind of monograph which repeats the mistakes of the academic past. The mistakes of the academic past would be a monograph of experience. To make it a little simpler, perhaps for some, at least it was for me, it'd be like saying, a person who works in a sweatshop on the other side of the Rio Grande in a maquiladora, who is a woman who cannot go to the bathroom, has no kind of prenatal care, cannot get time off for pregnancy, is working 16 hours a day and is continuously harassed and suffers all kinds of on-the-job modes of potential death from the workplace conditions, that person is suffering in a way that is essentially different than a professor in Stockholm who has a social democratic safety net, a higher salary, and a shorter working day. Do you see what the problem there is? The problem is that no, they suffer experientially differently, but they both are confronted by the command modality of capitalism. In other words, both their labors are labors which extract surplus value. They both suffer the intensification of the working day, and they're both alienated from their labor power. It would only a fool would say that the professor in Stockholm doesn't live better than the person working in a sweatshop, but it would be theoretically imprecise and also just inaccurate to say that the mode of suffering is different. No, the mode of suffering is the same. And so this is part of what we're trying to argue here, that Patterson suggested that it doesn't really matter if a slave is part of the Ming dynasty in China, wearing long robes and working as a civil servant, or if the slave is being whipped up and down the alley where 450 plantations exist, where my father's side of the family comes from, that part from New Orleans all the way to Baton Rouge, and are being worked to death, or if the slave comes from New Orleans or various parts of Alabama, where slaves sometimes are not working, but are simply injected with poisons to study how they die with these types of diseases. The lived experience of the slave cannot be the baseline articulation of what makes for slavery. We have to look at the relational dynamic, and we have to look at paradigmatic violence. And paradigmatic violence is very difficult because it's seeing it is like throwing ink or paint at the invisible man. So this is what Patterson brought us to, right? The three constituent elements of slavery that exist and have existed everywhere there has been slavery, regardless of how the slave lives his, her, or their experience. And those elements are, as you know from my book and other readings, general dishonor, which is to say that you are dishonored in your Black skin prior to acting in a dishonorable way. Natal alienation, which is to say, getting back to the first diagram where I kind of corrupted Freud's topography, that you may think in your secondary processes of signification that you have a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, and that's what you think. But your kinship is not recognized by the paradigm. You are alienated from natality by the people with the guns and the power, and gratuitous violence, which is very, very key, which is to say that your vulnerability to sanction and appropriation of your flesh in any way, for pleasure or for punishment, your availability and your vulnerability is open to the non-slave class. And this is vital to our understanding of the difference between the assassination of Black people by the police and the assassination of brown people by the police. We have to make that distinction. But Patterson says that, and here's where I'm coming, we're going to wind up now. The corrective, our corrective to Patterson is in his notion of recruitment, because he says that the slave is natally alienated, generally dishonored, open to gratuitous violence, all of which we agree with, But then he says, no matter how the slave is recruited into social death. And our argument is that Blackness is not an identity. It is not a set of cultural signifiers, essentially. Remember, I'm only talking essentially, I'm talking about position. And there's no prior plenitude of equilibrium for Blackness, meaning that Blackness is elaborated in social death, not recruited by social death. And I can return to a greater definition of that later. So there's no narrative equilibrium in the life of Blackness, no prior plenitude. Note the Arab, Moroccan Jews, Chinese, Iranian, Iraqis begin vamping on East Africa by 625 AD. They produce, the Black eunuchs have their entire genitals cut off in East Africa. It's not the kind of castration that the Italians will perform in the 15 and 1600s on 13-year-old boys in order to make them better opera singers. It's called leveling at the scrotum, in which knives are used to scrape up to the pelvic bone. And these boys are marched to the eastern coast of Africa, and those that live cross over and become eunuchs in harems, and Black women are captured to be the flesh of a licentious sexual destination. This is really important to grasp because it's not the kind of slavery that has the utility based in economic production of the so-called New World. The utility here is in service to the development of Arab et al. Filial coherence over a period of about 800 years. The deployment is situated in Patterson's elaboration of the three constituent elements of social death. So what I'm trying to say in a nutshell, and I haven't written on this, but graduate students I work with have, especially Parisa Waziri at Cornell, that you can't have, and her work is on Iran, you can't have an Iranian family, you can't have an Arab family without the symbiosis of decades, of hundreds of years of a destruction of African families that work in tandem to make who we are as filial relations possible through the destruction of what's called African capacity. Finally, slavery did not end if we accept Patterson's corrective. It did not end in 1865. And if we accept Afro-pessimism's corrective to Patterson, Blackness is a position, not an identity. In short, the inaugural division that makes the world, not just filial, psychoanalytic, or the world of political economy, is the inaugural division between the Black, the only being who is never not a slave, and the human. Again, slavery, according to Patterson, is not a historical event. It's not a cartographic locale like the South or a plantation, and not ownership by one person over another. And this, I'm going to leave a deeper explanation of this aside because I want to end and open it up. But if you want me to talk more about this, I will later. This whole why can we not use ownership as a definitional element of slavery? Very important point. Slavery is a paradigm, not a performance. It is gratuitous violence, not contingent violence. A violence that produces human psychic stability, ergo anti-Blackness is not a form of discrimination, but a necessary bond that heals the wounded psyche of the world via semiotics of difference. Now I'm going to close with two things here that get at a little bit more of what I mean. So I'm going to send these to Evan and Celeste, so you don't have to grasp it all here. But what I'm trying to say is that on what's my left side of the screen, which is scan 31, what we have here are two triangles of people or organizations that are in blood and violent, seeming antagonists with each other. Okay, maybe I'll do one at a time so that we can see them. Sorry, better. Yeah, okay, that might be better. All right. So on the left, we have here the IRA or the PLO against the British government or the Israeli government. What am I trying to do here by this triangulation? By drawing this at the base of these points on the triangle here. I'm suggesting that colloquially and even theoretically, people talk about these encounters as antagonisms. And we are trying to be theoretically precise at the top of the screen here to recast them as intra-human conflicts secured by, from semiotics, a third-term mediator. Third-term mediators are conceptual frameworks out of the symbolic order that allow for a coherence between IRA and British government, between PLO and Israeli, even as they kill each other. This is precisely what the opening chapter of my book is trying to get at, where I and my friend from Ramallah are both rabid anti-Israelis at the level of pre-conscious, but our structural position cannot be reconciled as suffering subalterns because what he shares in his psyche is a collective, in other words, what allows for a relational dynamic between him and the Israelis, even as they're killing his people in Ramallah, is that they have up here secured the war through the symbolic order, the concept of land or cartography. That means that, in the words of Fanon, they have ontological resistance in each other's eyes, which is to say, I am killing you in Ramallah, I Israeli, or in the West Bank, as a subordinated subject, not as an object. I recognize your capacity to map a certain type of cartographic sovereignty on endless space. I recognize that capacity. I don't like that capacity. That capacity is inferior to mine because when I came here, I made the desert bloom. You know, that big Israeli saying, right? You know, it's kind of like Walt Whitman. The Indians loved us for chopping down the trees and killing them. You know, we talked about the progress, you know. But still, what I'm trying to say, this is a relation, even though it's steeped in violence. And we're going to see in the other diagram, there's no relation between the Black and the other. And that relation has to do with the conceptual coherence of what this bloodletting is all about. It's the it's an understanding of whose cognitive map will prevail over the symbolic order as manifest through land. This is what's meant and I'm sure as psychoanalysts, you understand the importance of third term mediators in the analytic session, because one has to take the analysts on out of empty speech, which is this kind of collapse of the imaginary that is deployed through primary forms of signification, which do not, primary forms of signification, condensation and displacement in dreams, for example, that do not allow for the trauma of the analyst on to be returned to relational logic. You've got to secure it with paradigm and syntam, as opposed to condensation and displacement. And this is what a war does right here. So contingent violence and hegemony. Okay, the same over here with a more abstract view. The Red Army faction in, Rita Meinhof and Andreas Bader in Germany fighting against West Germany and NATO, or any working class formation fighting against the capitalists. This comes from a paper that I wrote and a book that I interrupted, which I was trying to deal with revolutionary groups around the world. Some of the articles have been published and to show why the Black Liberation Army was in the Panthers in the United States, even though the damage that they did to the state was minuscule compared to the damage that the IRA did to the British government, and compared to the damage that the Palestinians do to the Israelis, and minuscule compared to the damage that the RAF did to West Germany, why the threat of a Black revolt looms larger in the collective unconscious than any of these groups does, okay? And this is, so we've got temporality here, which is a Marxist attack on the way the working day is organized, right? You want to work half-time as a worker to produce only use value. This is these people down here. And we over here want to continue to exploit and extract temporality from you so that surplus value can be accommodated, right, or achieved. So what makes these bloody, often genocidal encounters legible and intrahuman is the value they secure from what they are not. They are antagonistic, they are not, sorry, that should have been, I wrote this really quickly. They are not this antagonistic encounters because they cannot be analogized with the master-slave dynamic. Okay, last thing, and then we'll open it up. So now we have a diagram of the slave. The Black versus the human antagonism is not a conflict. Why is it not a conflict? Because there's no third term mediator, because the Black has no ontological resistance. So here on the 3 papers that I've written, I've dealt with the Black Liberation Army and the FBI, but you could also just write it about Blackness writ large versus humanity writ large, okay? What we have here is gratuitous violence because there's no transgression needed for this violence to be fomented against Black people, no contingency, no conflict between different perspectives of the organization of the symbolic order. In other words, at the bottom of this page here, what has been very interesting to me is that the FBI, for example, for now 101 years, has had the most sophisticated Black literature department in the world. They have been studying Black poetry, Black creative nonfiction, and Black fiction since 1919. And it is a major part of the operation. I mean, the CIA used to think that the FBI were a bunch of polyester suited Irish people who went to Fordham University and couldn't get into Yale, okay? They found out, that by 1950, the FBI had been turning all Black literature under the rubric, under the lens of a very, very detailed analysis for at least 50 years before the CIA even got started. And they rotate Black writers in and out of what's called a preventative detention list, these are the writers that they're going to circle up and put in preventative detention camps should Black people set it off in the streets. But one of the interesting things about these declassified documents, and let me just show you here. this book right here, FBI's, by William Maxwell, details the entire department at the FBI, which for 100 years has been not only capturing Black literature that is published, but Black literature that is unpublished. I have a scene in my book, Hattie McDaniel is Dead, in which people have broken into my apartment and simply photographed my books and my paperwork, you know. But they have been doing this because if you, and this is good, I mean, as psychoanalysts, you understand this, if you read the literature of a people, you can have that literature provide you with a leading indicator of where they are going in terms of struggle. In other words, if in 1966 you had read a book called The Man Who Cried I Am and analyzed it, which I believe that the FBI had done, you would know or intuit that in 2 years, something like the Panthers were going to kick off. You know, you'd be able to sense these books of the early 60s are moving from a kind of view of a structure of feeling of accommodation into a structure of feeling of revolt. And so what I'm trying to say here is that the last point is that in none of the declassified documents of the FBI or the intelligence branch of the Maryland Police Department, State Police Department, which wrote an 80-page analysis of Assata Shakur and the Black Liberation Army, what is missing? What is missing? What is missing is an articulation, an understanding of what the Black threat is. And I think that absence is profound and important. It is very profound because every other group that is surveilled by the state apparatus has in that surveillance a kind of understanding of what would it mean for these people to prevail. They get Puerto Rico back, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, they get the country back. But no one can write a sentence on what it means for Black revolt to prevail. And it's not the absence that I want to fill in, it's the absence that I want to think about, because that is profound. It means that, returning to Fanon, the Black is a stimulus to anxiety in his, her, or their corporeality, whereas the Jew is a stimulus to anxiety at the level of the concept. And that is really vital. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure you all have a lot to say, and we'll see where we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank. That was great. I'm just going to jump in, and I think perhaps we'll have a little flexibility on the time. There's going to be a lot of people who want to ask questions, so we'll just negotiate and see where we are when we are scheduled to go to 6.
No, I can stay to 6:30. I can stay as long as you want, because I know I took longer than I said I was.
Yeah, Lynette warned us that was probably going to happen, but we didn't believe her.
Did you, Lynette?
I'm going to jump in with a question that I pre-formulated, sent to Frank. Then I'd like to take a few minutes just to ask the others who have already presented on our organizing committee if they have questions, and then we'll open up to everybody. So, oh, of course I can't. I thought I could. All right, I thought I could cut and paste into the chat. That's not working, but I'm just going to read my question, which I sent to Frank as well. Okay, so I'm talking about the book Afro-Pessimism. I say this is addressed to Frank. The book begins with a breakdown, which it returns to at the end. At the end of the book, you are still searching for a narrative that will explain the psychotic breakdown. This structure of repetition is familiar to psychoanalysis in its attempt to integrate what is repressed, foreclosed, or traumatic. In the middle of the book, you reflect on the difficulty of forming a narrative for that which has no rational basis, but which instead forms the basis for the rational order as we know it. Much of this seems familiar to psychoanalysis. The timelessness of the unconscious that Freud noted seems related to the atemporality of the slave. Elsewhere, in a Jungian mode, you speak of anti-Blackness as the substrate of the collective unconscious. What is less easily understood within traditional psychoanalytic frames is a category of being that is outside of narrative and outside of time. The problem is that even if psychoanalysis accepts this clinically, we are left in practice with something like either something that's simply a human psychoanalysis, including narrative and temporal progression, basically as we assume and know it today. Then we would have something that would be like a human to slave psychoanalysis, in which those within narrative and time work on behalf of those who do not, which Frank says elsewhere is bound to fail. And finally, we would seem to be left with the other alternative in which Black analysts outside of narrative and outside of temporality work with Black analysts, ditto. Frank, you note that this is a major problem for critical theory if it is to take seriously Afro-pessimism, but it seems even more daunting for psychoanalysis since it's not only a matter there of the theory, but a clinical practice. And I end by asking if you have further thoughts on that problem.
Well, besides the fact that I've been reading my mail, listen, what I tell everybody is that, you know, when I start class with that little stick figure where I do a little thing on Freud's early typography, I don't do this for grad students because they signed up for this abuse, right? You know, so but for undergrads, I say, you know, you got 2 weeks when you can drop this goddamn class, you know, don't tell your parents anything about what I'm talking about, you know, because I'm a full professor, step 6, I got a job for life at a public institution. There's nothing that can, so you got to make a decision here. This is only bad news, okay? This is like, you know, and so, yeah, what can I say? I can't help you. I mean, it's, you know, we can talk, but at the other side, I want to say this before I get too flippant, because I have a tendency to be a little too flippant. The schematization that I laid out to begin with, Evan, was about the essential dynamic of the relation. I'm not saying that there's no value in the psychoanalytic encounter. In fact, you know, my book, my contract for the book was 100,000 words. I turned in a book of 150-some thousand, and they didn't think it was a funny joke, so they made me spend 3 months cutting it down. I thought, like William F. Buckley said long ago, you can do whatever you want with a book. I guess maybe if you're William F. Buckley. So I would have written about how I spent 10 years with a white psychoanalyst. It was kind of like the McDonald's of psychoanalysis because it's so goddamn expensive. I could only go twice a week. So I'm not poo-pooing analysis. I mean, that thing that happened 20 years ago when I was 44 was partially about post-traumatic stress from all the violence I'd seen and been involved with in South Africa, partially about coming back to an America which I think is actually worse than apartheid South Africa, partially about the inability to, for people on the left to grasp the to even be alive to the singularity of Black suffering, and partly having read David Marriott's On Black Men, in which, you know, he says, really what we're talking about here is you can't think the Black unconscious like you can think the unconscious of anyone else. So my short answer, that was a very long, complicated question. I was kind of chuckling throughout it, some of it, you know. My short answer is to, and it's my answer to Fanon, because I think that David Marriott is a better Fanonian than Fanon. I also know that if Fanon were here today, he'd denounce me because his intentionality was as a humanist. But we're reading him against him. And I would say that those moments in which he tries to solve the problem of gratuitous violence through the toolbox of analysis and psychiatry are the moments when he suffers what could be a terminal disease. And that disease is clientitis, where your discipline becomes your client. That's right. And so I would say to the Black adolescent, metaphorically, because I know the FBI is fucking watching everything, metaphorically, bring your therapy, but bring your gun. This is not a situation that can be resolved outside of violence. And so but I'm also not saying that Black adolescents need to go to Black psychoanalysts or Black psychologists. In fact, I was studying. I mean, I had studied psychoanalysis I came to Berkeley as a grad student very late in life. I was 41 years old in 1997. And before that, I had another life in the late 80s at Columbia, working on a master's in fine arts and fiction. And I took at least one, maybe two classes from Stephen Marcus, who was a great Freudian theoretician, and he team taught this class with a practicing psychoanalyst. And then I studied Silverman's book, but I just lost my train of thought. Even as I was having that breakdown on the gurney in the psych ward at the UC Berkeley Hospital, I was watching myself being watched. So I knew that the most important thing here at this particular moment of a psychotic episode was not to get healed. The most important thing was to make sure these two white people didn't feel threatened. And after that, I sampled a number of Black therapists and psychoanalysts because my parents were both psychologists, and I grew up in a community of psychic healers. But what I found was that they could not perform the labor of the acephalic subject. In other words, and this is not a condemnation, because I feel the same way towards my daughter, okay? In other words, they cannot be the headless subject sitting on the couch waiting for my speech to bounce off the walls and find itself back to me. They felt they needed to make an intervention to save me from the suffering at that moment. And that's not good. That's like ego building therapy, find your inner child, all that bullshit. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody. I tend to do that.
I think you're okay in this company.
Okay, and the point was to let me go crazier over a period of time until I found myself. Now that solved a certain problem, but it didn't. But here's what Lacan would say. Lacan would say that you move from that psychotic episode, you move through the narcissism of empty speech, you move from tenacious fixation and this filling up of the signifier, this kind of entification, to something else. And then what do you get? What's the payoff? A diminishing of the intensity of the affect, right? So you can go about your life without somatic compliance of a nervous tic or whatever. And you can return to a kind of ethical relation with your contemporaries, which is to say the rest of the world. That's where the break is, because there are no Black contemporaries. There are human contemporaries. And so Blackness was never in relationality. So in other words, Black psychic healing is always going to be provisional. And if you read my second book, which you have and some others might have, where I get deep into Lacan and Silverman, in the second or third chapter, I would also argue, rather provocatively, that the psychic healing of all others is unethical, because it secures an ethical relation internal to humans and also intensifies the egoic monumentalization of the human race, making Black deeper and deeper, more others. So I don't think there are any tools internal to civil society that can help Black people with liberation. Those are tools of various aspects of hegemony which do help other people with ultimate interpersonal as well as revolutionary transformation. Black people don't need transformation inside the world. What we need is the end of everyone else's capacity to make world.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the members of the organizing committee? Just unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
I have a kind of comment and a question. So Frank, as you were speaking, especially in the part where you're explaining the kind of critical rupture that, taking classes with Silverman had the kind of influence, but also the way in which you departed from her. I remember, something, I know that David Marriott has been an earworm in our conversations in this space and also in your own work when you engage with psychoanalysis. But if I could read something from an older essay very quickly to the way in which I think it helps kind of elaborate on the way in which you're thinking about or trying to move away from the so-called crises in the kinship structure of Oedipus. And he writes in an older essay called On Racial Fetishism, which is elaborated and revised in his book, Wilderson On. He says, by returning to the question of Oedipus as a moment of crisis for the Black colonial subject, which is of course itself a highly Oedipal production, is playing on theoretical possibilities that are inherent in Freud, namely that Oedipus in its classic version is always a question of cultural legitimacy for both sex and generations, that it forms the bridge between culture, the legitimate inheritance of a culture, and the intrapsychical work of generations. And this point, that you've harped up on in your own teachings in particular, you said, echoing Marriott, what does it mean for Oedipus to go missing?
Yes.
And I think for me, that was a through line in your own, just working with you in your elaborations, even though you say they're not elaborations on psychoanalysis. And then I had a very separate question, actually, aside from this point, because I was teaching George Jackson as Assata Shakur in my own class this week. And I don't know why I never realized this before, and it's quite obvious, but the way they're both thinking about the Black collective unconscious, and they talk about it in their own writings, but they're almost radically different from one another. And I think the way that Shakur, and kind of echoing your own theoretical itinerary, Jackson's obviously drawing from Mao and Marxism, but also Fanon himself. But Assata Shakur makes this point. We were reading Who We Are, Women in Prison, and she's writing from the women's prison in Rikers Island. And she makes this point that they don't have political education workshops in the women's prisons in Rikers Island. So the kind of political education workshops that her contemporaries have. And obviously, George Jackson is also writing to his brother, Jonathan Jackson, and other members of the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers. But she's kind of illuminating, the limitations of political consciousness within the structure of the women's prison. And I know that Shakur was really influential in your writing writ large, but also within the genre of auto theory or auto fiction. So I know I've asked you this question before, but could you maybe say again why, or maybe talk about the way in which Shakur's influence has had on you in this genre of writing, but also the way in which maybe Jackson and Shakur are thinking about the Black political unconscious or consciousness?
I'm going to ask you to help me with the latter part, because my teaching of Jackson goes back about 15 years. Although I teach Assata Shakur, I've been teaching that book every year. Let me just see, for people who don't know it, and I'm glad you reminded me. It's just a stellar book. You have to read this. For those who don't know, you're all New Yorkers, so you probably know Assata Shakur. This is called Assata, an autobiography. It came out in 1987. Assata Shakur, I think she's about 10 years older than me. She must be about 74. And She's living in Cuba, thankfully. There's a whole village of revolutionary exiles that I visited outside of Havana, people who were purged by Pinochet, people who were purged in El Salvador, lots of Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army people. And Castro has just set up a nice little village for folks. Then last time I checked, she still had 3 bullets in her chest from a shootout with the Jersey Turnpike. And, you know, here's the funny part, Lynette, about your question. I was asked, I thought, you know, I wrote my second book, that now I'd secured that second book for professorship, and now I could go back into fiction. And so I was kind of working on the articles about structural violence and revolutionary organizations. And I was spending a year in Germany on the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, but I was also using that time that I didn't have to teach or do administrative work to get back to fiction. And shortly after that, Verso Press and the New Press in New York called me up and they want a book of essays. So I said, yes, I'll do this. But I didn't want to give up because I wanted to break into the trade market. I didn't want to continue just writing for small presses and university presses. How's that for good communist? Wants money. So I then thought that why don't I just take the stories that I've written in my journals, and because they are exemplary of some of the first principles of Afro-pessimism, and kind of splice them together with more critical theory language and discourse into one book. And this book did that back in 1987. Now, the thing about this book, because it's a Black woman and she's a revolutionary, not a civil rights organizer, you can't bring your manuscript of what you're doing, which is very different than what's been done, which is to say that for 3 chapters, you're going to have memoir-like stories, and all of a sudden, boom, you're going to be thrust into a kind of theoretical apparatus, you know, then you're coming back and out. You can't just bring that to a New York trade publisher who needs to make money and say, let's do this because it's been done by Asada at a small press, right? As one of my uncles used to say, to get over in life, you need 2 things, and both of them are white, right? A white friend and a white piece of paper, okay? So, the white piece of paper is your degree, and your white friend is someone who runs interference for you, you know? And without that, you're going nowhere, Jack, right? So it was really Maggie Nelson who wrote The Argonauts that my agent and I used to pitch an understanding of what I was trying to do in this new book, Afro-Pessimism, to New York trade publishers. That's the lie. The truth is right here, okay? And this is, you know, but I can't bring a Black woman in who's from a small press, who's taken up the gun against the government and say, oh, this is kind of like the architecture, not the story, but it's kind of the architecture of what I'm trying to do. No, I think Maggie Nelson is much more acceptable, and she greased the wheels, metaphorically speaking, for me a lot better. But you're right, Assata Shakur starts off with a shootout on the Jersey Turnpike. And then she's in the hospital chained to a bed, and the pigs, excuse me, that's a term of endearment, in case you didn't understand that, right? are beating her and punching her. And it was at one moment where she says, and this is when I was teaching this in 2005, it kind of went off, you know, because I was writing incognito and trying to find a structure for it, you know. And she says, I want a phone call to call my aunt and my mother. And the cop says, oh, you have a mother. And then the whole thing opened up. I mean, the whole book kind of opened up in a way, for me, beyond what Assata Shakur had intentionally articulated, because her intentionality, the argument that she's making, is as a Marxist internationalist. And from that moment on, I was able to read the book as a person who had been alienated from gender capacity and from filiation, not simply the articulation of the intention of the author, who's saying, I've been alienated from my labor power as a communist. And that really deepened my understanding, which is to say, what Black people say but can't say because it can't be heard in a particular way. And so I think that the stories, I read it symptomatically, and I wrote one of my papers on the Black Liberation Army in response to that, but also is the way in which she played footloose and fancy free with narrative structure. And that was very, very helpful to me. You know, if she needs to lure a part of a speech from Abraham Lincoln from the sky, lure it from the sky from ropes right into a narrative scene, she'll do that. And so what I felt I had to do, though, is to do what she does and what Baldwin does, but to make it, but to risk myself more, which is to say, stand in the middle of a room, pour gasoline on yourself, and light a match, and then you start to write, you know, which is to say, risk the exposure of what she couldn't say so that it could meet Black people on a more immediate level. So I hope that helps.
Jameson, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Frank. Thank you so much for that. I have a funny feeling, which is that I wish I could go through the Lacan scholarship and versus the Lacan academics and like separate them, because I feel not identified with the Kaja Silverman-esque version as a clinical Lacanian, whereas I'm so identified with what you do in your book with Lacan. And, but then I feel like this is just my problem because you're doing just fine without us clinical Lacanians, and this might be something, for us on our own to think about. But I so much want to bring to the table like the later Lacan or the clinical Lacan, because there's so many things that I want to say about, like, Lacan is not a taming of affect. It's not an entering into an ethical relationship of kinship. It's not humanism. It's not, re-narrativization. So I kind of wanted to just put that out there. And then, really in the end, I wanted to read you this quote that really shows Lacan as a Afro-pessimist, if you were. That I thought you would really like, and that Laura Shipai and Patricia Garavici helped me translate, like in the back of your talk with Google Translate, and her husband and Patricia's husband working on the French because it's untranslated. So I'm gonna read it to you.
Okay.
He says, they started to have a little idea that they could truly make bacteria resistant to everything. From that moment onward, we could not stop these bacteria, and that maybe they could clean the entire surface of the globe of everything shitty, especially the humans that inhabit it. Then they were seized with a fit of responsibility. They put what they called an embargo on a certain amount of research. Perhaps they had an idea after all that this wasn't a very good idea. That it could really be dangerous. I don't know if I believe this. I think animal life is indestructible. It's not that the bacteria wipe it out, but these people had an anxiety attack. It was a typical anxiety attack. Anyway, they threw out a prohibition, or at least a very provisional one, and they said that it was necessary to look twice before we pushed any further idea about pushing this bacteria. It would really be a sublime relief if all of a sudden we had a real scourge to deal with. A scourge that came at the hands of these biologists. This would be a real victory. That would really mean that humanity had arrived at something, its actual destruction, for example. It is truly there that a sign of superiority above all others, not solely one's own destruction, but the destruction of the entire living world, that would be a sign that man was finally capable of something. But we're not there yet. We're just capable of anxiety at this point.
That's beautiful. So yes, thank you very much. I take your point. I want to. That's why I started off by saying my training has real limitations. So that's very. Where does that come from, by the way? What?
It's a text called La Troisième from 1974. So it's also, again, very late Lacan.
Yeah, I did not know that. So you're right. I come through the critical theory, literary theory, and feminist theory utilization of Lacan, and I don't have any other experience with it. I certainly don't have any experience with it clinically, and this is so. I will say this rather jokingly. Had I had that quote in 2004, it would have thrown a real wrench in the works of my second book, because I would, I'd have to be kinder to Lacan than I was in my second book. Yeah.
I do think that, what you're speaking of in terms of this kind of strange humanistic ideal reintegration is something that happens in psychoanalysis. But it's not, I think, the version of psychoanalysis that a lot of us here work with, and which is what makes your work important to us.
Thank you.
I think the question for us is what to do. So I appreciate that you say that, there's room for the couch and what you're talking about, but this cannot be a reduction of violence. So,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I want to really reiterate, because I took psychoanalytic classes at Berkeley. I took psychoanalytic classes at Columbia, but they're all through comparative literature. You're absolutely right, and through rhetoric. Okay, and then I learned psychoanalysis, laterally through being a fellow student with Jared Sexton. Now, one of the things that I've done as a director, when I was director of the Culture and Theory program, is I really hammered the faculty to completely upend the first year methodology courses. And Lynette was part of that project. And so now every first year student in Culture and Theory has to have as one of their methodology courses a course on psychoanalysis, normally taught by Jared Sexton, and then a course on the foundations of Marxist theory, which is where we read Das Kapital, 532 pages in 10 weeks, because I felt that people were talking about the psyche in their dissertations and talking about value and really not having a grounding in that, And I think that text that you brought is really important. And I would encourage you to, I don't know if you'll come or not, to invite Jared Sexton, because without Jared Sexton, there'd be no Afro-pessimism as an interpretive lens. And right now, Afro-pessimism is like a big time bomb inside of the humanities, actually creating a crisis of comprehension in the humanities writ large. And it really comes from the fact that I had come back from trying to fight a revolution which Mandela turned into a get out the vote reformist accommodation thing, and I was pissed off, and came back, and I was so tired of people talking about hybridity and access, and I said, I was constantly harping in a reading group that Jared started, why are people no longer talking about the essential antagonism? I mean, goddamn, that's all we were talking about in 1970. Why has that left? Why do people just want to live in this goddamn country as opposed to undo it, And he was the one who said, what if we thought the essential antagonism through anti-Blackness? And that was the crisis moment for me, because I was trained as a Marxist, and the crisis manifests itself in the first chapter of the book. But right now, he's also working on a second degree as he's a full professor, where he's training to be a psychoanalyst at a school in Los Angeles, 50 miles north. So I just think that people like Lynette and David Marriott and Jared Sexton and Sally Terefri are the kind of psychoanalytic wing of Afro-pessimism. And I know a little bit, but I didn't know that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from our organizing committee before we open up? I know we also already have some hands up from others.
I know that I've already asked a question, but if I could just place a little bit pressure on the previous question by Jameson. I mean, the way in which I interpret Afro-pessimism in its relation or the way in which it places pressure on psychoanalysis is not necessarily that it is trying to make a stark distinction from psychoanalysis. And I think thinkers within like who Frank has already mentioned himself, Sexton, Marriott, it's not in disagreement with the pessimism of psychoanalysis, but so there's no disagreement with that, but the anxiety is, or rather pointing out the anxiety in response to Black suffering. And so, yeah, I think that's the kind of rock in the hard place that Wilderson, Sexton, and Marriott pointing in, especially the kind of clinical practice and context of Lacanian psychoanalysis.
No, that makes sense to me. You know, I'd love to like have a much longer conversation about the human versus the slave and what, like, can they actually be signifiers when they're concepts and paradigms? And then where the question of the anxiety comes in. But I mean, I think this is like a fascinating nudgety argument, and that right now we really want to kind of honor the question of Frank's book. But I mean, I think this is very rich for us to speak about our experience as clinicians, and then these more fundamental topics of racial anxiety. So,
Patricia, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to discuss your work before and now with you, and maybe to try to remind ourselves of, as Jameson put it, that we work with the clinical Lacan, not with the academic Lacan, and also with the truth revealed by the clinical practice, and a sort of version of Lacan that, as he says in Aggressivity in Psychoanalysis, a human that constitutes his work by suicide. That in a way, by reading your work, we can reread an Afro-pessimistic Lacan, which is quite inspiring for us. And maybe with the contributions of the later Lacan, I was thinking of the theory of sexuation as a way out of the limitations of the Oedipal model, and even of the phallic premise that perhaps, and with that, in addition, the idea of the symptom, no longer a symptom or even a social symptom that one needs to get rid or cure, but rather a symptom that could be a creative production. That would be one comment. But I have a specific curiosity reading your work, and I would like to ask you, when you pose the idea of a Black person as socially dead, and whether or not you believe in reincarnation, the Christian idea of reincarnation.
Oh, me?
Yes.
I left the Catholic Church when I was 12 years old. You know,
And
well, this is interesting. I don't know why this question makes me uncomfortable. I mean, maybe I feel like Woody Allen. Can I go now? You know. Okay, let me do a shrewd pedagogic move and ask you what you're trying to get at before I. I'm being kind of serious here. What are we? Are you really asking me what I believe beyond the secular?
I was thinking whether or not there was an idea of futurity. And what would it be like?
You mean on the other side of social death?
Whether or not that exists, that's the question.
Yeah. Well, I try not to think about that. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I really do. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of any discursive intervention that tries to imagine that. And part of the reason for that, but I will tell you, but I have a life outside of my books, okay? And you, why don't you unmute yourself so that you can interrupt me if I start speaking symptomatically, you know, away from your question. Because for some reason it's unsettling, and I actually don't know why. So, you know, my belief system, I don't try to calibrate that with Afro-pessimism. I don't try to calibrate what I believe with a analysis of how Blackness suffers. So, but I will just tell you that belief might not be the right word, but I commune with through various forms of Voodoo, which is voodoo or Santeria or Rada. So I have a spiritual, for lack of a better word, well, the traditional word is Babalao, which is a West African priest of Voodoo who's from Cuba. But I also don't believe that there's a divine intervention that will solve the problem of anti-Black racism. It's for you know, and even if I believe that, I wouldn't offer that. It would be like offering Christianity or Islam. Black people are atheists, agnostic, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and devotees like myself of voodoo. And I don't think that where we are is a function of that spiritual world. You know, Patricia, I'm having a little trouble, as maybe you can help me, because what are you trying to get at with this particular question? You know, what am I supposed to be talking about?
Whatever, if you have thought about a big one.
You know, you have to pay you $100 for this hour, and then we, you know, I mean, so that I just talk until we get somewhere. No, I'm being joking, but I'm being also halfway serious. What exactly are we talking about here, and what motivates your question? What do you want out of this question?
It was just a question if whether or not there was a dialectical, considering the Marxist possibility of a dialectical movement. Are we reaching an end of history? More like, is there a temporality? Because you're talking about your book has to be read ontologically.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm introducing maybe, since we, as psychoanalysts, we are not outside of history, I'm introducing maybe whether or not there is an idea of...
Okay, you want to introduce temporality.
Or not. No, that's my question. It's a genuine question. I do not have an answer. It's a genuine question.
Okay, so I will be short and genuine with you. I want to resist conversations about temporality. Part of the reason why I want to resist it is because Sexton has said, and I repeat it, and this is not just true of people out there, it's true of me in here, that when people encounter the first principles of Afro-pessimism, their first response is what he calls the anxiety of antagonism. And I have the anxiety of antagonism. I mean, I had it for 20 some years, trying to raise you know, one of my daughters, right? You know, in the sense that there is the sense that filiation is the birthright of everyone. That the problem with filial oppression is the organization of kinship capacity. But everyone has kinship capacity. And to be a Black parent is to somehow tell that lie about your Black children over and over again, you know, as though there is the capacity for some type of sanctuary, which is a recognition of a domestic sphere, or that the recognition that you're someone's child, and that the violence that you will encounter has a lot to do with how you act in the world or where you go. That's absolute BS, okay? And so there is no Black sanctuary, there is no Black protection, there are no Black fathers, there are no Black mothers, there are no Black children. Black people are extensions of the master's prerogative. The fact that that extension, existing as sentient flesh, existing as an extension of the master's prerogative, may not look like what it looked in 1853, but if you really look more deeply, what you can see is that, as Jared Sexton has said, you better understand white people's fantasies, because tomorrow there'll be legislation. And this is the thing, that we're in a soup of no no capacity for sanctuary or safety, temporality in terms of time does not get better, and time was not worse. And we're in a soup of structural violence cartographically. In other words, there's no space that you can go in the world where what organizes communal relations does not have at its core the anxiety of Blackness, okay? So that's, and so when I think of, when people start to write about the future, they're writing using the tools of a symbolic order that is always already overdetermined by anti-Blackness. And so those tools are not the effects of divine intervention. God didn't make this happen. But I do not believe that you can think about a free Black future inside of the epistemological dome that we exist. Now, hear what I'm saying. I believe you can get there because it wasn't always like this. But on the other side of that, there will be no Black people and there will be no humans. Just like on the other side of capitalism, there will be no workers and there will be no capitalists. But what a reorganization of a baseline structure can do with capitalism is imagine what that other thing would be on the other side. And it's called proletariat. What a baseline structure of the desire to destroy the Oedipal construction of the nuclear family can look like under this can actually be imagined. It could be some type of transgendered communal philia organization. You cannot write a sentence. Just like I said, the FBI and the intelligence community cannot write a sentence about what is the Black threat. What do Black people, what is the embodiment of the Black demand? Because it is the demand for the return of everything.
You just said something that was another question that I had. Was I couldn't help but see on the left side of the screen that you had a folder, transgender studies. And then you mentioned this transgender organization. And I was extremely curious about that. If you could tell us more, what do you mean by that exactly?
I don't know, because that's the folder for one of my grad students who's educating me. I'm supposed
but you just mentioned the word, the transgender organization. What do you mean by that?
Well, okay. Now I think the session is over, Patricia. So I'm in the position of the analysand.
I'm in the position of the analysand. I'm lying on the couch. No worries.
This is, I don't know. I'll be honest. I'm speaking in kind of large abstract ways, and talk to me in 2 years when Jamie has written his dissertation. I've learned everything, but I will answer your question directly. Okay, what I mean is this: is that there, and I'm going to go over here. I'm going to boomerang back. Is that one of the first principles of semiotics as why, the word is not the thing. If I would say, when I teach undergraduates, I'm teaching them semiotics now, and I say, where is a table? And they go, I say, okay, let's table this discussion, right? Then if this is really a table, and we say, let's table the discussion, you would throw this at me, right? So the table, there can be no transparency between T-A-B-L-E and this piece of wooden object in front of what I'm sitting at. If you believe that, then you cannot you've shown that you cannot cross the bar of metaphor, and you're suffering some kind of malady. So that suggests that all words are, in the words of Saussure and Peirce, endlessly commutable. The word can travel, and this is part of I would say, the optimism of psychoanalysis, that the trauma can be returned to relational logic by using secondary processes of signification to relieve the analysand of the intensity that tenacious fixation has attached itself to words as thing. Words travel. They don't mean they're not a window on the world. I would argue, however, that the N-word is emblematic of a word that cannot be rejuvenated, resuscitated, that it marks a sentient being who's elaborated and positioned by direct relations of force, as opposed to a sentient being that is elaborated and positioned through discourse. And that is precisely why Black/slave is a necessary anchor for the coherence of any stratified civil society. It's a necessary anchor to know what is the world of discursive oppression as well as discursive counter-hegemonic freedom, whether it's the counter-hegemonic freedom from the couch or in the streets. And what is the world of the sentient being who is always already not in the world? And for that reason alone, I do not believe you can use symbolic labor to think about the other side of anti-Black subjugation. There can be another side, but it's going to be like the fire next time. Sorry, Patricia, our session's over. I got to go home.
Well, we do have a bunch of people lined up waiting. So Daniel Butler next, and then Marissa and a few others. We have hands up, but if you could go Daniel and then Marissa after Daniel. Daniel Butler to start with.
Thanks so much, Frank. It's really great to have you. I think that your work is really important for psychoanalysis to struggle with. So my question, I want to see you. I see Evan right now. Okay. My question or slash comment, it's about something that I see as one of the principal ways in which your work challenges psychoanalysis, but obviously correct me if I'm wrong, namely that the clinic itself is overdetermined by an anti-Black civil society. Okay, so, right? And so I'm like, okay, great, as a clinician. But I think, and yet there's this other side, because libidinal economy is obviously a very central concept for you. And I think today we spoke about it a bit more in terms of kinship it needs to be differentiated from kinship, certainly, but that was sort of the lens through which we were thinking psychoanalytically for the most part. But you talk a lot about libidinal economy. And so one of the questions that I have for you is, I've wondered, and I think this comes from a clinical perspective, I've wondered about, and also just thinking about Fanon and the role of the clinic for him in tandem with his revolutionary activity. I wonder if the anti-Blackness of civil society can somehow be taken up within the clinic, if only at the level of libidinal economy. Now, and I just wonder about that. And I think what you just said about symbolic labor, it's like, okay, so what if the clinic is not the site of speech? What if it's the site of action? I mean, for me, I love Winnicott and Ferenczi, and they're just, and like play therapy, and it's like, that is not symbolic sometimes. It's destructive. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it is not really in the interest of a communication between two beings who mutually recognize each other's languages, but is a destruction on the part of one as a display of force in the interest of bringing some kind of ontological status that had not existed prior to that destruction into being.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll stop there, but I'm so glad to have you with us.
I'm glad to be here, Daniel. Thank you. And thank everyone. And Patricia, I was joking with you. It's good to be uncomfortable sometimes, right? So I only have kind of impressionistic snippets of how to even enter into what you're saying. And but I think it's really, really fascinating. And so right now in my life, I'm in what's called book promotion mode, which means that I'm going virtually around the world, just repeating the same thing over again. Okay, and this has been the most intense kind of exegesis that I've had to do. And all that stuff that's been read and over there needs to be reread, which I'm in marketing mode. So that's probably the most superficial. You're getting the most superficial aspect of me at the moment. But I do think that you know, the people I mentioned have something really prescient to say about that. And you know, Lynette read from Marriott. You know, Marriott's been my guru for, I had to kick him off my committee because he's British and too exacting. I'm like, come on, dude, I'm 44 years old. I cannot write in this pristine way. I'll be here in my 50s. I'd be here now if I were writing to his standards, you know?
Yeah, I just qualified with him, so yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, you know, I'm like, God damn, I need a superficial American to just sign off on this dissertation so I can get a job, you know. But I'm serious, and we joke about this. He was on my committee for a while, and he'd send me these chapters back with all this red ink, and I'm like, dude, you know, I got a teenage daughter, and I got to make some money, you know, I got to get out of here. But he's profound with respect to that question. And I think that there is something to be said about that in the epilogue of The Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about colonial wars and mental disorders. You know, there's really something, he's getting at a different way to do the psychoanalytic session. Just, and you know, which is precisely why I think he was second in command of the psych ward in Algeria, and he's asking the adolescents, the patients, to tell him about what they're dealing with, not to assume that there are these categories of mental disorder that then apply. And what he finds out is, wait a minute, these people are suffering political oppression. You know, they're not crazy. Well, goddamn, let me just get me and my wife and kids, you know, and pack up and drive into the night and join the revolution, you know, because this is not where it's at unless I get to run the show. And I think he learned that particular lesson. I've learned it anecdotally. You know, I taught at Compton when I first came back from South Africa. Now imagine I've been teaching in Soweto, thinking that this is like the worst of the worst. You know, I saw state violence against the young people I was teaching that I thought I would never, you know, see. But I grew up in a white neighborhood in Minneapolis, right? And then I started teaching in Compton, and I'm living with my brother in West Hollywood, and it's like I'm in two different countries. And, you know, I'm sleeping in one country and teaching in another, and I'm seeing the forms of police aggression against junior and high school students that would not even be thought of by the Internal Stability Unit in Soweto. And I had the really interesting revelatory moment whereby, and so this is not the clinic, but it's the classroom, you know. I'm trying to get these 8th graders to, you know, pay attention to me, you know, and I get really, you know, because I have a kind of build where I don't get easily intimidated. I'm like, okay, let's get together, you know. And one of them lifts up his shirt like that and shows me his gat. You know what I'm saying? It's a 45, you know. You know, and he's like, motherfucker, if you keep this up, I'll blow your ass away, right? And so I'm like, this is a very interesting classroom, you know what I'm saying? And so I made this, so I compounded the mistake with kind of Negro bourgeois intervention by saying, you know, when I went to Dartmouth, they'd only been integrated for 3 years in 1974. They never had more than 30 Black people at a time there, you know. And we rocked up at an economics class, and the cat says, the professors. I know we've been integrated, we've had to integrate according to state sanctions since '69, it's now 1974, but I still do not believe that Black people have the acumen to study economics. So I'm going to ask the 3 Black students if they would leave, you know. So I'm telling this to these 8th graders, like, if you don't get with the program that I'm trying to do and educate you, you're going to encounter that kind of thing later on. And one of them says to me, so what did you do? And I thought, I said, well, we left. And he said, but you blew his ass away, right? And I said, no. And then they said, well, what is it about you that thinks you can walk into a white space without a gun? And I was like, okay, now we need to get, you know, taught here. And then another one says to me, have you looked around here? You know, what kind of bullshit are you actually telling us? Are you saying that if we sit quietly, do all the shit that you're saying, learn from you, that we'll all get out of here? Or are you saying that 1 or 2 of us will get out of here? What are you saying? And I just had to like, oh, okay, all right. And so, you know, I was a substitute teacher, so I wasn't going to be with them for a long time, but it really got me out of that kind of bourgeois, middle class form of governability that I have something to bring to you. You should sit quietly and be obedient and learn from that, you know. And the next week I was posted at Compton High School to teach a course on nursing. And I got there, there's no toilet paper in the bathrooms. The windows were broken. I was supposed to be using computers. And everyone told me this with a straight face. There are computers, monitors with no computers, okay? And there was no lesson plan and no books on nursing. And fortunately, because I'd had my ass handed to me by those 8th graders last week, I said, okay, let's now talk about, you know, it's a class full of Blacks, Samoans, and Latinx people, right? I said, let's talk about the way you interface with healthcare. And I brought a couple articles on anti-Black discrimination in the healthcare arena. And you know, that class was so well organized, and so the people participated without the kind of shenanigans. It was because, quaff and on, I brought it back to what they had to say, not what I had to bring. And I think that's a very valuable lesson.
Okay, Marissa, and then after that, Tariq.
Hi, I'm not sure how to pose this question exactly. It's a question about genre, because I feel like it's very easy for us academics and psychoanalysts to all like sort of treat our text, or I saw Derek Cook give a talk recently where he pulled out all of his books and he was like, these are like my records. It was very cute, but I mean, I kind of want, so I'm just going to say a bunch of jumbled stuff, which is that I kind of want this to be a little harder for even Lacanian psychoanalysts than to say Lacan already got there, which I don't really know if he did, but that's, and I don't know how people practice Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I'm an anthropologist, and that's part of my question. But I do have the feeling that if the analysand and the analyst, if at least one of them was bringing a gun into the room, that there'd be like something very challenged about even how we just talk about this work at all, like the way that we're talking about it or have been talking about it in these sessions. There's some, like, to me, it feels like there's a flight away from things that's easy for us to do with like words and with texts and with referring to texts. So I have a question about genre, because what I really liked about your book was its genre and the way that you used, I mean, I guess you would say interweave storytelling and theory, but it also reminded me of something I'd been thinking about with Fanon and the way that he uses genre and interweaves theory with his clinical work that makes you think about psychoanalysis differently. even then when I'm reading Lacan or Deleuze or like any of those guys who are clearly trying to do something transformative with language, there's something different about Fanon where it is accessible in a different, like the feeling of it is like the way you intake it is totally different. And maybe that has something to do picking up on what Daniel said about like subverting transference. I'm taking this idea actually from a Black Lacanian psychoanalyst named Willie Apollon, who says he takes everything from Lacan and everything from Freud, but in his but he goes further, and in his psychoanalysis, he subverts the transference. Like the transference is flipped on its head, and don't know what he means, but I've been thinking about it. And one thing I was thinking was kind of what Daniel was saying about like destruction versus interpretation, where instead of interpretation is replaced by destruction of the relation between the analyst and the therapist. But I do have the feeling that as this happens, or if it happens in our psychoanalytic institutes or us as psychoanalysts or wherever it may or may not be more or less likely to happen, that it'll even change the way that we kind of discourse with theory like altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have I just have an amen and yes to what you're saying. I don't have are you wanting me to say something specific to?
Well, I mean, I guess what I was wondering when I said the question about genre is like, if you have thoughts about that based on the genre that you chose to write your last book in, if you've thought, I guess, yeah, instead of just me saying a bunch of stuff, I do have a question about genre, and I'm wondering if you have a point of view on it.
Well, as Lynette brought up, it is the genre. I mean, we call it auto theory, which is the kind of lived experience spliced together with theoretical reflection. And I said that I sold the book, to for $35,000 advance, as opposed to a $1,500 advance from a university press, by marketing it, making it legible to publishers by evoking Maggie Nelson. I'm grateful for that. Like I said, white friend or white piece of paper. But I didn't mean that, right? What I meant was Assata Shakur. And so, let me just see. I want to call you by your name, so I can't. It's Marissa. Is that okay? But Marissa, what's more important to me in writing than a kind of coherent, conscious, deliberative investment in genre is affect. And so what I want to be sure about is that I'm writing through and to a kind of iconoclastic Black affect that takes no one else into consideration. So that, and I want to give, hope you all bought the book, so I'm going to tell you something. I want to give offense to everyone else. To make it like a big choking horse pill that people who think they're our allies will have to choke on and to get down, so that Black people can. Jared Sexton said it really, really well. I'll give you a little example about what I'm writing through. We were in a political organization, and I won't put all the details because we don't have enough time, but we had about 1,000 people who were doing mass civil disobedience at Berkeley in 1999. And there was this agreement that the Black students and Black people from Oakland came on board with rather reluctantly. And that agreement was that under no circumstances would we react violently. This is supposed to be a peaceful civil disobedience. And the Black contingent of that had tried to push for making that provisional. In other words, I'm not invested in, my history in South Africa and elsewhere, I can't possibly be invested in nonviolence since I've been part of a violent struggle, you know, and I would never raise nonviolence to a principle. It's a tactic, just like assassinating police officers is a tactic, or writing letters to the editor is a tactic. I'm tactically flexible and strategically rigid. This is back to the chapter where Said is talking about. And so there was a tension between, on the one side, East Asians and whites and Latinx people, and blacks on one side, where they were actually treating the demand that we be nonviolent as a principal investment. And we didn't even want that. We just lost the vote. So we agreed to it as a provisional tactic, okay? And at one point in this occupation, one of the cops there was a black undergraduate who was sitting cross-legged, and he on the ground, we had chained ourselves and occupied Barrows Hall, and he pulled him up by his dreadlocks to a standing position. And this cop was about 230 pounds, 6'2", and the kid that he pulled up by his dreadlocks to a standing position was about 5'4", okay? When Shahid landed on his feet, he swung at the cop, and the cop went back. Then he swung again, and so he kept swinging. He wasn't connecting, and at some point, the cop realized, I got a gun. You know, I don't have to take this shit, right? And it's that's when he vamped back. Okay, now these people, Shahid and 8 others, were put on trial, and the University of California said to the Alameda County Courthouse, prosecute them to the hilt. And they were going to spend 18 months at San Quentin, because you can't touch a cop, that's assault, you know. And they were put on trial, and we had a big meeting about this whole episode and what to do. And in the meeting, our lawyers, I've lost Marissa, is she there? So, okay, well, I'll keep talking. Oh, there she, okay. Thank you. In the meeting, our lawyers had gotten the video of this incident from the Alameda County Sheriffs as part of a discovery for the pre-trial stuff. And we were watching it. And at that moment, when Shahid comes off, he's being lifted up by his dreadlocks. And when he comes to standing position, he swings. The blacks in the room started cracking up. Everyone just started laughing and going right on. And then non-black people are calling white people like, that's not what we agreed on. That's not what we agreed upon. And then, you know, someone said, fuck you, you know. And that's, at that moment, Jared Sexton said, all right, here's the deal. We're going to be in the streets with you for your sovereign rights, for your immigration rights, for your no Spanish in the schools, for all the stuff that you want with respect to access and expansion of civil society. But we're going to be marching with you and fighting with you for those things, but we're also going to be ridiculing you at the same time. So the puniness of your embodied demand is something that we'll be struggling with and treating as a source of humor while we're down with you. And that, Marissa, is what I want to recreate in my work, because an NPR journalist, I was on a radio show of National Public Radio, and she said, is there any joy in Afro-pessimism, you know? And I said, yeah, but you gotta understand, what makes me laugh might make you cry, okay? And that's where we are. It's the singularity of that address that I want to recreate.
Okay, we have Tariq and then Daniel G after Tariq.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilderson. Thanks for your generosity for staying with us past time. I mean, as we're talking about the message of the memoir and the affect and the genre and the narrative structure behind it, I wanted to ask kind of about, you know, you've written 2 memoirs and they read differently to me. And I wanted to ask about kind of the genre and the affect and kind of if you could compare both. I mean, I read Incognegro and I read it as, you know, someone retelling their life or kind of telling the story of their life, and then you're incorporating, infusing theory throughout. And then in Afro-pessimism, we start with the psychotic break, the realization of the gravity of Afro-pessimism, and we're starting from a theoretical lens, and here's my life as a case study through this theoretical lens. And so they read very, very differently to me in those regards. So and they've been both very meaningful, impactful, informative books throughout my life. So I wanted to ask you about kind of how they each came to be, and what the affect behind each is, and what the relationship between them are. And sometimes as a writer, I'm sure maybe there's an imagined audience, and who is the audience of each book, and maybe asking about the audience is kind of an absurdity, given that the gaze and the imaginations of many of the readers render the idea of a narrative or a narrative arc impossible in that regard. So I guess each of them is an attempt to make sense of the life in the world. How are they different? How did they come to be? And how should we read them as separate, as together? Those are kind of my questions for you, Dr. Wilderson.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Incognito was written when I was making $20,000 a year, because I had been fired from my job as a teaching assistant for, what I didn't tell Marissa is when those 8 people who acted in civil disobedience were arrested, they were put on trial. I helped organize an attack on the Alameda County Courthouse, which involved 25 people ultimately bum rushing the courtroom, throwing the judge and the prosecutor out, and commandeering the courtroom for about 7 hours until the state troopers could come, and which we let the press in and turned the courtroom into a trial for the chancellor of the University of California and other people. So I was in my 40s. I was very poor. But I was also writing that book without any permission, or in other words, there was no one called Frank Wilderson in the world at that time. Okay, now there is. Okay, so it's like a completely different embodiment at 63 when I started this book to 40 something when I did the other one. It's an embodiment with money, a nice crib. I mean, it's still Orange. I don't have Orange County money, okay, but you know what I mean. It's a very different thing. And I also got people asking me for work, so I can take time. I can figure out what I'm doing, and I'm not writing in a subversive context. Meaning, anytime you write as a Black person, and there's Black rage in the streets, you write better than when you're writing and there's no Black rage in the streets. It's just, this is something I could chart at all kinds of writers, like the quality of the verb and analysis of the 50s versus the 60s, for example, And so I'm writing now after Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, because I'm not even confected with the reformist objectives of Black Lives Matter. I'm confected with the iconoclastic subversion of that larger thing called the movement for Black Lives that I've met in the streets of Vienna, that I've met in Berlin, and also the thing about Incognito is when I was 350,000 card-carrying members of the African National Congress existed in 1992, and when Mandela and his cronies, in my view, orchestrated or helped give a widget of information to the Conservative Party about Chris Hani's whereabouts, and he was assassinated, and then they marginalized Winnie Mandela, there was a lot of internecine violence that people have not written about that took place in the ANC. And that's why I start off Incognito. And I'm put on a list by this guy, John Kwankla. He used to be head of internal security for the guerrilla movement, Mkhonto Wesizwe. Now in 93, 94, he's head of what would be the new CIA for Nelson Mandela, the NIA. And he's charged with neutralizing, this is the documented words, 10 people on the ultra left. Now I'm one of them. And he's charged with neutralizing 10 people on the so-called ultra right, so that the rapprochement between Black capitalists and white capitalists can come about. So I'm under a state hit list that is motivated by the very people that I was in the underground with, right? And I'm now leaving South Africa. It's 96, and I've been purged from the party and from even my teaching jobs. I'm getting a divorce, and I say to my commander from the underground, can I write a book? And what do I really want to do? I want to tell people specifically about 3 covert operations that I was involved with so that people can understand that I was really involved in armed struggle. And he says to me, no, you can't write this, okay? So I thought about it for a little while, you know, and then I just start writing anyway, you know, because so you've got this oscillating chapters through my life in Minneapolis and California, and I'm getting, and then I realized that what I want to do is monumentalize my ego to let people know that I did some real shit, right? And so I stopped that. I may write about these 3 operations I was involved in at some point in my life as fiction or whatever, but instead I wrote about our underground activity, about the majority of what I did, which is psychological warfare and secret propaganda. The majority of what I did was not involved with guns, but the people that were running me were actually doing that. So his name is Heinrich. He was my handler, my commander, and he bombed the Conservative Party, which orchestrated the assassination of Chris Hani. When it turned out that we could not start a massive uprising through that bombing, he and another student of mine who was also in the cell went back to the rubble. They threw their identity documents into the rubble so that they could be captured by the state security forces. They deliberately orchestrated their own capture so that they could be tortured for 6 weeks and that they could come out and take their place as above ground activists to try to stem the tide of bourgeois accommodation that Mandela was driving us to, because they were not known politically above ground. I had 2 roles, elected official above ground and underground. And so they orchestrated their own capture and their own torture so that they could then participate in above ground politics. That's in the newspapers. So I wrote about that. I wrote about gun running. I wrote about my time with Chris Hani. But I was always cautious in a way that then, 20 years ago, that I was not cautious now, right? No one was waiting for that book. In fact, no one, even in my family, and certainly not my handlers, gave me permission. Everyone was going to be against it, and I didn't have any money, right? So it was a very different thing. I was writing at white heat, and it wasn't available. And then it went through. I mean, it was a horrible, horrible time. I mean, because there were so many white women in the publishing world. And when they got the argument, which was the elaboration of the things that were happening between me and my wife, right? The argument that Black men are physically more stronger than white women, but they are also, whether they're married or not, the slaves of those women. In other words, that the dynamic between white femininity and Black masculinity is still one of domination. And I was sly, right? Because I would hand them chapters. I won't say the name of the press because now I'm so popular, I might get some money from them. They might forget that shit, right? But, you know, okay. But I would give them the South Africa chapters, you know, and they're like, oh, this is great. Then I would give them the California chapters. They're like, as a feminist, I can't, you know. And I say, well, make me an argument, not a sentimental assertion, but prove to me that Black masculinity, A, exists, and B, that it is institutionally more powerful than white femininity. And they wouldn't, you know, so my offers went from $50,000 down to $30,000, down to $7,500 of 3 different presses, so finally got to South End Press with the 2 Black women who read it. And they said, this is the shit we've been trying to tell white women forever, you know? And they published it for $1,500. I don't have to take that kind of chump change anymore. And I have, you know, well, Marx will say if it's a job, it can't be good. But I was going to say I have a good job, and I got people calling me for my next book. So very different world, very different person. Yeah.
Okay, we have one more, I believe, Daniel G.
Hi, Dr. Wilderson. Thank you so much for spending an evening with us, just talking about all these themes related to Afro-pessimism in your book. I mean, it's exciting to hear that Jared Sexton is undergoing psychoanalytic training, but you're a natural. And you said earlier tonight, I can't help you, but we can talk, which is the most psychoanalytic thing you could ever say. I want to hone in at this one moment in the book that I found really impactful and really useful to think through, kind of both clinically and politically, in the epilogue, where you talked about your one student who was talking about her, I think it was her mom and her boyfriend, and the way that that really captured this distinction between ontology and performance. I guess having that as a backdrop, what I want to ask is that for Black people who begin to ascertain, whether as writers or folks on the couch or just people in the street, the non-contingency of the world's violence, they might conclude that if, for example, nothing matters, it's non-contingent, then blank. And that blank could be filled in a number of ways, like if nothing matters, then nothing can be done, or then burn it all down, etc. And so I guess with that in mind, thinking of something like Nietzsche's statement, nothing is true, everything is permitted, is this possible as a kind of living within social death? Like, to give another form of it, if everywhere Black people go, they're subject to random gratuitous violence, then doesn't that in a way license that they can then go anywhere? Because it doesn't matter materially, in a sense. There's no real boundary and you could do whatever the fuck you want.
Well, just say a little bit more about the last part. They could go anywhere. Just translate.
Yeah. Like, I'm speaking less in terms of ontology proper and more in terms of how people react to it.
Okay.
So if somebody comes to the conclusion that really anywhere I go, I'm just going to be subject to this gratuitous, random, pre-logical violence, and it's going to happen everywhere. Yeah. And you have some people say, well, then nothing can be done, right? They stay home, they chill out. Somebody says, burn it all down then, because it doesn't make any sense. Then somebody else might say, well, if really anywhere I go, this will happen, then because there's no continuity telling me don't go, bad things will happen to you.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, like I guess like an adolescent in a way, or a person who realizes all these rules are bullshit and they don't have like, I guess in a way I do have my professor from seminary, James Cone, in the back of my head.
Yeah.
But I was curious about that because he was really big on this idea of the Christian concept of death has no hold over me because we're already dead in Christ. And I was thinking about that, especially when you said in the beginning, you can't have humanness unless you believe in God. And then I was like, oh, so is Afro-pessimism what happens if, God is dead in Black theology? Like, I don't know, those kinds of. So even though it comes from a theological place of, death has no hold over me, I wonder in a secular sense, if that articulation makes sense or if that's a possibility within social death.
I don't have a clear answer. I do need to read. I was introduced to James Cone a year ago when I was very shocked when 10 Black theologians, Christian theologians, asked me to come spend 3 days just in a room with them. That they do this thing like every 10 years in Wabash, Indiana. I'm like, what? And it was very, very interesting. And that's how I got introduced to James Cone. Because they were saying there's points of articulation between what you're saying and what James Cone is saying. And I was very surprised that the Black theological intellectuals are different. These were anyway, in their ability to do exegesis and immanent critique on the Bible as opposed to being cathected to it emotionally, which is different than, say, Black pastors. So I have been hearing this about, and I wish Cone were still here so I could speak with him. And I felt that was a really groovy 3 days in that one little room, because they were as interested in the end of the world, and their analysis was that Christianity is organically anti-Black, so it was really heartfelt. I know we're running out of time. I can stay as long until the last question, Evan, but I want to say that you're asking me something that I've thought about and I don't know the real answer to. And if Lynette wants to chime in, because you know how I get like a deer in headlights sometimes, you know, especially when my age starts showing, I get tired. But here's the deal. I think that the scale of abstraction at which I very quickly had my opening remarks do not account for the ways in which anti-Blackness is lived in different parts of the world. And so it's there. We lost you, Daniel? You still there? He's still there. It's there, but how can I say this? This is what I find valuable about the way in which young people, revolutionaries in the townships today in South Africa, in Soweto, in Khayelitsha, in the universities, are carrying the texts, my books, Saidiya Hartman's books, Sexton's books, you know, as the texts of what they're trying to do, when the general wisdom is that, no, you should be reading post-colonial theory as opposed to Afro-pessimism. And that's this kind of sophistication in which they're able to articulate as a grassroots movement. It used to be called the Land First Peoples Movement. Then it was the September National Mbizo Movement. They keep changing their names, but it's a mass movement that is saying, yes, in very important ways, we suffer neo-colonialism. Black Americans do not suffer neo-colonialism, but we're interested in an essential grammar of suffering. So if we raise the scale of abstraction, what we see is that the whole world would lose its coherence if it ever lost the organizing principle which gives society its anxiety, which is to say the question, where are the Blacks? What are they doing? Okay, and so so I do believe that with that as my luggage, right, I personally have been able to go to Vienna and hold Afro-pessimist workshops that deal with the specificity of what it means to be a Black person in Vienna, articulated through the generalized narrative of what anti-Blackness, how anti-Blackness organizes the world. It's like being a sophisticated Marxist as opposed to a vulgar Marxist, you know, being able to see the extraction of surplus value everywhere while paying attention to the particularities of that oppression. And so, and I think that kind of, that has, I mean, what people don't realize is there's a global Black consensus being developed underground that's gonna bite the world in the ass when they realize what the kinds of connections Afro-pessimism has made. You know, I couldn't believe that the Tate Modern Museum, you know, this is what they thought they were getting Professor Wilderson and Professor, they gave us a big room to do an Afro-pessimist workshop for 35 Black activists in London. You know, I'm like, really? Are you, do you know what's gonna go down here? You know what I'm saying? You know, and so
just right quick, I mean, as a real compliment to you, like, even though your discussion of ontological Blackness and James' discussion of what he meant by ontological Blackness are different, pragmatically, the way that your work has helped people across the world tie these things together was very much the kind of project that he had in mind.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's nothing that is, you know, it doesn't come from me. It doesn't come, it comes, it's a true form of Pan-Africanism, which is not based in culture, it's based in suffering. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Frank, so much for extending the time and for everything that you've given us today. We've already started speaking about doing ongoing reading groups and study groups, so I hope you'll accept an invitation back, even in our fantasy post-COVID, when we might share the same room at some point. So I think unless anyone is really dying to have a last question, there have been no more hands. So how about we call it a day with much gratitude to you, Frank.
Thank you, and much gratitude to you all as well.
Thank you.
I'll send you those notes, Evan and Celeste, so you can distribute them if you want to.
Okay.
Really appreciate this. You all have a nice night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for an amazing presentation.